Welcome on behalf of the Art Society North Wiltshire. This is a second in a series of videos made by our members, and we're calling them Moments with a Masterpiece. In our first, we took one painter, Benozzo Gozzoli, and we looked in detail at his sumptuous masterpiece, The Journey of the Magi. Now we're going to take one subject, the Adoration of the Magi. From the dawn of Christianity to the High Renaissance, it was one of the most popular subjects in the whole of Italian art. And we're now going to take a look at these 10 wonderful images covering 1,200 years of history. We're going to see some beautiful spiritual images. But beneath the surface of these stunning masterpieces are powerful stories of schism and religious persecution. The Magi bear witness to iconoclasm and the willful destruction of great art. They become part of the struggle for power between church and state. And the most powerful rulers in Florence exploit them to legitimise their battle for power and their right to rule in this city-state. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In the beginning was the Word, so let's start there. Not with John, but with Matthew. Because it's Matthew who is the origin of the biblical story of the Magi. Matthew tells us there were wise men, but not how many. He tells us they came from the east and were guided by a star. And when they arrived, it was not to see a baby in a manger, but a young child. And they fell down and worshipped him and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense and myrrh. But the earliest surviving Christian images of this scene come 2 centuries later. And this was art conceived in secret. It was art painted by a persecuted minority, their paintings buried in the catacombs. We have here on the left a wonderful ethereal image as 3 men emerge from the mists of time, bringing tribute to Mary and her child Jesus. But already at this early stage, the iconography is becoming established. We have a horizontal line and a procession towards the Virgin. Their arms are outstretched. They bow slightly forward. Often in these early images, their gifts are not identifiable, but sometimes you can see them carrying a wreath. We have a figure in the second image behind Mary. You might think it would be Joseph, but in fact it's the prophet Balaam, because the origins of the way the Magi would be depicted actually predate Christianity. And as so often in art, you have to look backwards to look forward. And here we're looking backwards to Persepolis and the palace of Darius the Great. Because the story of the Magi in its early versions is a story about tribute and worship. The concept of tribute being paid to the king can clearly be seen in these Persian images. And the Magi themselves were Persian in origin. They were the priestly caste. They were revered for their knowledge of scripture and astrology. The early Christian writers emphasized that Christ was revealed not to the Jews, but to poor shepherds and barbarians from the East. By the 4th century, the Adoration was one of the most popular images in Christian art, and it predated nativity scenes and was often seen to be more important. It features particularly frequently on Roman sarcophagi. And the iconography is now established. We have that clear linear procession. Here we have 3 Magi with outstretched hands bearing gifts. In other forms of Christianity there may have been as many as 12 Magi. And we clearly have the Star of Bethlehem. Jesus is seated as a child on Mary's knee, and Mary is seated on a chair which begins to resemble a throne. She's a simple woman here. She's not the Queen of Heaven. But what I like most about this image are the wonderful camels. Their smiles shows how happy they are to have arrived at this majestic scene. But the story, like Christianity, is still in development. The Magi, as you can clearly see in this image, are not kings. They're barbarians from the east, and that's signified by their strange clothing and especially their Phrygian caps. And all three are young men. There is something different about this image. Look at that figure behind the Virgin. It's a rather sinister image. It's actually Joseph, and he's making his first appearance in the story of the Magi. I'm going to move forward now 2 centuries to Ravenna. Ravenna, the capital of the Byzantine Empire from 540, and the capital of Italy until the 8th century. In Ravenna there still exists wonderful, sumptuous mosaics. But behind those mosaics lie a story of religious schism. It's about the overthrow of Arian Christianity and the desecration of the original images in this church as the images of the Ostrogothic court and the ruler Theodoric were replaced by a new truth and a new Christianity. And in that new truth we see a transformed status for the Magi. Just look at them here, splendidly dressed in exotic clothing. They're still foreigners, but now they're princes. And we have names for them. We have Balthazar, Melchior and Gaspar. Names actually that were probably added later. Interestingly, Mary and Jesus begin to occupy more space than the Magi. They're becoming the prime focus rather than the Magi. So in this image, Mary sits on a throne flanked by 4 angels, and she presents Christ to us as God incarnate. Mary is dressed splendidly in imperial purple, and that's done to align Roman and Christian majesty. It's clear that Mary is becoming a central figure in Christian theology. Previously, the Magi were traditionally shown as the same age and all clean-shaven, but you can see in this image we have a new iconography developing. We have different ages for the 3 Magi, and that represents the 3 ages of man. Only the youngest in the centre, Melchior, is clean-shaven. Gaspar is shown as the eldest with his long flowing grey hair, and he's now the first to present his gifts, but is not yet kneeling. And in this image we can see that the Magi are arriving not in Bethlehem, but in Ravenna's seaport of Classe. And here they're accompanied by 21 virgin martyrs, and they come not on camels but in 3 ships. And everything is shown flat against a gold background. The colours of the mosaics just glow in the sunlight which streams through the upper windows in the church. We have clear classical Byzantine imagery, and that was not to change for centuries. So we're going to leap forward now 5 centuries to the 13th century. And here we have more mosaics, but this time from Rome. And we still have those clear links with the Byzantine style. We have the sumptuous gold background and the slightly elongated figures. But this image is a major change, and it reflects the change in Christian thinking, but more importantly in Christian power. In those earlier versions we had a simplicity of imagery because it was a persecuted religion, a church with little power. But now we have a church triumphant. The Magi are clearly established, no longer as barbarians, not even as princes, but as kings, and they proudly wear crowns to denote their new status. It's an assertion of spiritual and temporal power. Even kings have to remove their crown and bow down and pay tribute to Jesus. Henceforward, the medieval kings will be happy to be portrayed as Magi. After all, it's a spiritual endorsement of their divine right to rule. And in this imagery, we have a clear example of art serving both the church and the state. The next work we're going to see is of the same period, but it represents a seismic shift in art. Here we have Giotto, the father of the Italian Renaissance, the father of Western art. And in this fresco cycle in Padua, we can see so clearly why he is revered. Look at the figures. There's a sense of real bodies with realistic solidity, and they all exist in a real space, and that linear composition has been abandoned in favour of a much more complex presentation. The figures and the faces are much more individual. It's storytelling with a far greater degree of realism. And we have as well an emotional intensity. Just look at the reverential figure of the old king as he kneels to kiss the feet of the baby Jesus, and contrast that with the boy tending the camels. He's more interested in the camels and the story unfolding around him. And in one way that makes it a much more human and much more approachable story. So as the so-called Dark Ages gave way to the medieval world, Christian thinkers were redefining the relationship between man and God, and artists like Giotto had to find new ways of telling the Christian story. Giotto's account of the Adoration also reveals a growing reawakening of interest in science. Look at the red spark in the sky. It's Halley's Comet, and that was seen over Italy in 1301. We're going to move on now to Gentile da Fabriano and his adoration of the Magi. And gosh, what a difference a century makes. We've moved from the awakening of the Renaissance to the greatest example of international Gothic style, which was the dominant style in the last half of the 14th century to the early part of the 15th century. This work was commissioned by the Florentine banker Paolo Strozzi. When we had the church as a patron, as in the Giotto example, we had imagery which was simple and spiritual. Now we have a private patron, and we have instead a flamboyant display of wealth. The story is clearly about to serve a different purpose. In this close-up we can see incredibly expensive use of gold leaf, jewels embedded in the painting, the most expensive pigments surrounded by a magnificent frame. And just look at those flamboyant costumes from the East. When this picture was commissioned, the artist was paid 300 florins, a fortune. That was a year's income for a well-paid professional. And the picture captures for us the emerging importance of humanism and its impact on art. We see a much more naturalistic approach. We have recognisable portraits and a greater focus on the individual. We have realistic landscapes, flowers and animals. And truly we have a three-dimensional representation where larger figures are crammed in above shorter ones to give a greater sense of depth. And Gentile proudly displays his skill. Now just look at the horses, which are beautifully foreshortened, but he's not yet mastered the art of linear perspective, as you can see from looking at the building on the left. So in this image we have a private donor, and not surprisingly therefore the Magi return to the centre of the work. The donor is included in a very central position just behind the young Magus. And that central position underlies its importance. It's the Strozzi family saying, "We were there." They want to establish a direct link between their family and the origins of Christianity. The donor paid a fortune for this work, and it's therefore not surprising that it's there to serve his purpose. We move on now to Benozzo Gozzoli and the journey of the Magi. Time doesn't allow for a detailed discussion of this magnificent pageant, which covers 3 walls of the private chapel of the Medici in Florence. But if you want to know more, I'd encourage you to listen to our earlier recording. In Gentile da Fabriano, we have a late great masterpiece of international Gothic. In Bonozzo, we have one of the greatest artists of the early Renaissance. We have 2 fantastic sublime paintings trying to rival each other in their magnificence, and that reflects the intense rivalry and struggle for power between the Strozzi and the Medici. The Medici were ultimately victorious and the Strozzi family were exiled. In the Fabriano picture, Paolo Strozzi was certainly prominent, but in this imagery, the Medici, Cosimo and Piero are even more central to the story. Here we have Cosimo, he's in black riding a humble donkey, and we have Piero the Gouty mounted on a magnificent white stallion. The imagery leaves us in no doubt about the power and wealth of the Medici, and they're clearly using art to support their claim to be the divine rulers of Florence. Another banker, Gaspare da Lama, commissioned this work for the Santa Maria Novella in Florence, and he commissioned Botticelli to paint this work. It's one of 7 versions painted by Botticelli, and that just demonstrates how popular the subject was in 15th century Florence. The last 3 works we've seen were commissioned by bankers. So why was it so popular a subject for bankers? Well, it's because bankers were considered by the church to be usurers and therefore sinners. And the bankers, really in their support for the church, are trying to atone for their sin and ease their journey towards salvation. But let's pause for a moment and look at the composition and see if we can notice something fundamentally different about it. What we have is the Virgin at the very centre, and here she's raised in a dominant position. The design is a pyramid design with the Virgin at the top of that triangle. Botticelli was the first to introduce this concept into Florentine art, and it was so important that it was copied by the great Leonardo. We have as well classical ruins in the background, all displayed in perfect perspective. You could be forgiven for thinking that this work was another one commissioned by the Medici, because they're everywhere in this picture. Cosimo is shown as the eldest king on his knees before the Virgin. The humble banker is now elevated to the status of a king, and that completes the transition from Magi, who started as barbarians, became princes and are now kings, and now the all-powerful donors are even portrayed as kings themselves. It's clear that everybody is using the Magi to reinforce their status and highlight their power. Immediately below the Virgin in this image we have Piero, and next to him in white his son, Giovanni. Behind Giovanni, and in a prominent position, is one of his retinue. It's a black retainer, and as you'll soon see, this is an important step too in the development of the story of the Magi. Botticelli in the image on the right looks out at us and shows a new status for the artist who now deserves recognition alongside poets, writers, intellectuals and other champions of humanism. Botticelli is certainly innovative, but our next work, Mantegna, is even more daring and creative. In this work, Mantegna has excluded everything that's superfluous. We have just 6 figures against a dark background. 5 are shown half-length. Only the baby Jesus is shown in full. And we have a powerfully expressive close-up. We're invited to become privileged spectators at a monumental event. You can see there's little depth to the picture, but the figures have solidity, and that's because of the use of light falling from the top left in the imagery. The images are innovative in design, but the picture is also innovative in content, because we have the first black magus. In the earlier works we had the three ages of man, and now we see the story embracing the three continents. Melchior, the oldest, represents Europe and is shown as a wise sage. Balthazar in the middle represents Asia, and Gaspar, the black youth, represents Africa. It took a long time to establish the black magus, but henceforth it would become increasingly common in the history of art. There's nothing superfluous, as we've said, in this image, and yet there is something strange, and that's the blue china cup full of gold. And it's one of the earliest examples of Chinese blue and white porcelain. It's so rare and precious. Gentile and Bonozzo flaunted the wealth of their patrons, but here Mantegna finds a far more subtle way of demonstrating the wealth and culture of his patron. And here the baby Jesus highlights another feature of humanism, and that's the interest in the classical Roman world. Mantegna dresses the baby in a sculptured Roman toga. It's exactly the same as a priest would be dressed in Roman times. And now we're going to move to our final painting, a painting by Leonardo. It was commissioned by the Augustinian monks of San Donato, just outside of Florence. Typically for Leonardo, he left Florence for Milan the following year. And typically it's unfinished, so we're left with little more than a rough sketch. But what a sketch! It clearly shows the influence of Botticelli in the pyramid design, and in the background we have similar architectural ruins. But what we have in this imagery is a far more complex, and you might even look at it and say chaotic, because it's a complete departure from the conventional imagery that we've seen to date. We don't have here the pageantry and beauty and order of Bonozzo and Botticelli. We have instead a raw emotional integrity and urgency. We're moving from a spiritual journey towards a spiritual revelation. It's a cataclysmic spiritual conversion. The birth of Christ is a tumultuous, dazzling event, and that's how St. Augustine would have seen it, and the figures emerge from an atmospheric smokiness. Leonardo, a master of sfumato and chiaroscuro. And we have such strange images, bearded, grimacing, skeletal faces of old men, and look at those grasping hands. It gives the picture a huge sense of action, and if that wasn't enough action, in the background we've got a battle scene with wonderful rearing horses. And that background is important because it presents a contrast between background and foreground, and it represents the triumph of the Christian world over the pagan world. And with that triumph, we've reached the end of our journey. 10 beautiful works across 1,200 years of Italian art. What a journey the Magi have been on, and what an amazing story it makes. Art historians, beginning with the legendary Vasari, have traditionally seen art as a progression from the primitive to the glories of the high Renaissance of Leonardo, Raphael and Michelangelo. But modern art historians now see it in a much more nuanced light. I think it's that greater complexity which we've seen here. We've witnessed how religion, politics and power have helped to shape one of the greatest stories of Italian art, and we've seen how the church, kings and the wealthiest in the land have used this sacred imagery to proclaim their legitimacy and their power. But ultimately, the Adoration of the Magi is a spiritual story. So I'm going to finish by asking you which you think is the most spiritual of these works. My choice might surprise you. Here it is. I hope you think it's a wonderful image too, so please use the comments box to share your feedback and tell us what your choice would be. And for more information about our society, do visit our website. Our 300 members really love the arts and they love learning more about them. If you do too, then come and join us.